Good afternoon, and welcome to this installment of PolicyMap's Map Chats webinar series. My name is Bryan Blacker. I am part of the data team here at PolicyMap, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this Map Chat. For those who are joining a Map Chat webinar for the first time today, PolicyMap, the organization behind this webinar series, is a national online mapping service that provides maps and data visualization tools for tens of thousands of indicators related to housing, health, demographics, and more. Map Chats is a free webinar series that we offer that features experts from a variety of topics, including housing policy, community and economic development, healthy food access, placemaking, and others. Our speakers discuss how their work incorporates data and mapping. So before we dive into the presentation, I'm going to start with just a little bit of housekeeping. So all participants on the webinar are currently muted. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the GoToWebinar panel. You can type your question into the control panel, and we will respond to you directly, or we'll read your question during the Q&A session, which will be at the end of the agenda. After the speaker presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end to answer questions. This Map Chat webinar will be recorded. The video and slides presented will be sent out by email and be made available on the PolicyMap Map Chats webpage. If you happen to be live tweeting right now, you can also use the hashtag MapChats to join in on the conversation on Twitter. So now that we have that covered, we can get going with the session. The topic for this afternoon's Map Chat is guiding principles for opportunity zones. The Opportunity Zones tax incentive was established as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. It provides a federal capital gains tax deferral and partial exemption for investments in designated areas. The intention of this program is to drive economic investment into distressed urban and rural communities, and it has the potential to attract billions of dollars in private capital, which would make it one of the largest economic development programs in history. And while there's great potential in opportunity zones, the program is in its very early stages, and there are lots of questions that still need to be answered as it is rolled out. We hope that this Map Chat will provide some additional clarity and guidance on the topic. So a quick agenda for the session. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Jeremy Nowak. Jeremy will be talking about the Opportunity Zones tax incentive and the 4 principles of the new localism strategy for the development of opportunity zones. We'll talk about an example of a state that utilized a data-driven strategy and the new localism approach for designating their zones. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So our guest presenter for this Map Chat is Jeremy Nowak. Jeremy is a distinguished visiting fellow at Drexel University's Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation. He created the Reinvestment Fund, one of the largest community investment institutions in the country, and was a co-founder of PolicyMap at the Reinvestment Fund, along with our president, Maggie McCullough. Jeremy also formerly chaired the Board of Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. He is the chair of the investment committee for Spring Point Partners, on the board of directors of the University City Science Center in Philadelphia, on the advisory board of the Institute for Urban Research at the University of Pennsylvania, and a senior fellow at the Center for Impact Investment at the University of New Hampshire's Carsey School of Public Policy. Jeremy also chairs the board of the Philadelphia Citizen, a new media startup devoted to solutions-based journalism. He consults on strategy for a wide variety of public, private, and civic institutions. A widely published author and columnist, he is also the co-author with Bruce Katz on a new book published by Brookings Press entitled The New Localism: How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. At this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Jeremy.
Bryan, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope everybody's having a great day. So I want to do a few housekeeping things, a few small advertisements, and then I'll jump into the conversation about opportunity zones and what we know and what we don't know and what we'll soon find out about the zones. But before I do that, 2 things I want to talk about. First, you who are on this webinar are, I assume many of you are users or subscribers to PolicyMap, and I want to give a shout out to PolicyMap. Of the many things that I've done in my career in community investment, I think helping to build PolicyMap was, I think, one of the most impactful and one of the most important things that I've done. And there's nothing like going to a city right now where I've been on a book tour and I'll be in a conversation with people and they'll refer to this thing that they use called PolicyMap, and it makes me really proud and really happy. So for those of you that don't use it, I would say go use it, go subscribe. For those of you that do and know others that could make use of it, please direct them to it. It's a great staff here. It's a great tool, and like all great tools, it keeps improving, keeps adding data, keeps trying to stay on the threshold of new ideas, tries to build new analytics, and I think the best is yet to come for PolicyMap. So that's advertisement number one. Second advertisement I'd say is about the book that I co-authored with Bruce Katz called New Localism. The New Localism's subtext is how cities can thrive in the age of populism. And this isn't only written for cities and metropolitan areas, although that is our major topic of interest. But we wrote this book, we began to write this book 2 months after the election of 2016, the presidential election. And we wrote it because we juxtaposed in our own minds some of the chaos in the federal government and increasingly in lots of state legislatures with some of the really positive, pragmatic things that are happening in localities all over the nation, in cities, in urbanized counties, in small towns, and rural areas. And this is really a book about the juxtaposition of that kind of activity. And the thesis of the book, very simply, is that the nature of power in our society is changing. And the nature of power is changing for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons is that we've gone through a pretty significant transformation in the last 40 years, given the nature of globalization. And in an era of globalization, where the nature of where the nation state itself, whether we're talking about the US or European national entities or other parts of the world, the role of the nation state is shifting. And as the role of the nation state is shifting, the meaning of local, and in some instances, the convergence between the local and the global become really pronounced. And so this was a book that really tried to understand what these structural shifts are about and ask some, I think, some really important questions about what are some of the growth strategies, what are some of the governance strategies, and what are some of the finance strategies that have to be undertaken or are being undertaken around the country and around the world right now in response to that. We do a case study on Pittsburgh, a case study on Indianapolis, a really interesting case study also on Copenhagen across the pond. And we spend a lot of time speaking about places from Louisville to Kansas City to St. Louis to Oklahoma City, where we think there are terrific things that are going on. So it's not a book about, we do mention some of the great things going on the coast, but this is not a book primarily about the hot cities of the coast, but it's really a book about some of the transformative things that are happening at a time when leadership increasingly has to be horizontal, which means they don't control everything anymore. Our notion of localism is not simply about local government, but about the interplay of the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. Sometimes academic institutions and hospitals obviously are important. Also, sometimes philanthropy become really important. And I'll use this last thing that I said as a kind of a bridge to the conversation about opportunity zones. One of the really important subtexts of this book is how vital it is for local communities to organize civic and private wealth for a long-term public impact, long-term public good. And we've got lots of examples of it. We have lots of examples of leadership in philanthropy and civil society in the private sector, along with the public sector doing that. Our view is that we're only in the beginning phases of that, and that in order to be effective, in order to finance the future, and when we in this book talk about financing the future, we're talking about financing inclusion, young people, how are they going to learn and be part of a growing global economy? We're talking about infrastructure, and we're talking about innovation. And so financing the future is going to take more than just a new public program, but it's going to take the smart organization of civic and private wealth in relationship to the public in order to move things forward. So the bridge to the opportunity zone conversation is that we think this is a potential tool, but it is a potential tool because it hasn't happened yet. We're going to get regs in several months, and we'll see what works and what doesn't work. So that's the context for this. So let me talk now a little bit more directly about the Opportunity Zone program. You've got in front of you a map, a great map that the PolicyMap people put together, which was a map of all the potential census tracts, low-income census tracts that were eligible, including some of the eligible census tracts that were not low moderate income, but were contiguous to low moderate income, that also had some criteria of eligibility. If you remember, those of you that have followed this, every governor, every chief executive of every state got to choose 25% of the eligible census tracts, and up to 5% of those selections could be contiguous to eligible tracts as long as they did not exceed 125% of the median income in those tracts. So one of the striking things of this map is how much of the country, in fact, was eligible. And what I would say is that one of the things that differentiates the opportunity zones from other kinds of tax credits, which is really important, or other kinds of tax incentives, which is important, is that first there had to be a choice. It wasn't just if you're in this place, it's eligible. You had to choose what tracks you wanted for that eligibility. And having spent a lot of time running around the country, in part on the book tour, in part on some consulting work that my colleague Bruce Katz and I are doing, we spent a lot of time talking to economic development people, to mayors, to governors about this issue of selection. And the question became for all of them, what's the basis for selection? Well, there was some basis because it had to fit the eligibility guidelines. But if it could only be 25%, why would you choose one versus another? And if there was anything that was really interesting about this, about having to make these choices, it was in the best of situations, governors and mayors and county executives, economic development people had to have something like a theory of why they would choose one place versus another. And was the theory a social need theory? Was it a theory about what they think is how the place has got some dynamism that they can add to, whatever the theory was. And there was a wide variation across the country of how people made these selections. And some states were remarkable, both in terms of the transparency that was utilized, and also in terms of their utilization of data. We talked to people in some states that were really on top of data, really on top of the spatial analytics. They were going back and forth trying to understand why they should choose one place versus another. Does politics also enter into it? Of course, politics enters into it. People want to have some kind of political distribution so that they're covered for all the various constituencies, and that's going to be natural in any public program. But the states and the locals that are going to do the best here, in our view, are the ones that within the context of political considerations still use data and had a reasonable kind of theory about this of why they would select one tract versus another. There are, I think, besides the selection issue, three other points of differentiation that are really important to note. The one thing is this is a much more market-oriented tax incentive than many of the other tax incentives or tax credits that many of us have been used to in using in economic development. The new market tax credit gets distributed in an allocation each year and gets distributed based on a competitive process, a very competitive process that goes through the Treasury Department CDFI fund. If you use the low-income housing tax credit, you know that developers, nonprofit developers, and for-profit developers go into competition with something that is generally driven by their local state housing finance agency through a distribution that is based on a federal formula. If you're used a historic tax credit, it's a compliance credit really related to the historic, whether it's a state credit or a federal credit, the historic characteristics and what can be done, what can be utilized or not utilized on the eligible basis for that credit. Unlike that, this is a credit where there's much more market orientation. Once the eligible tracts are there, the possibilities, you don't wait for anybody to distribute it. You really have, in essence, 4 parties to it. You've got the taxpayer who wants a capital gains deferment. You've got the qualified zone, which has been chosen. You have what's being called an opportunity fund, which is put together to put money into the qualified zone, and it's got to have 90% of its investments in qualified zones. And then you have the projects, which can be property or businesses in those projects. So this greater market orientation, on the one hand, lowers the barrier to entry for some. It also can make it much more complicated in terms of understanding what the social benefits will be in some contexts. So the good, the bad, the ugly of something that is more market oriented, I think is something we're going to learn a lot about over the next couple years. Secondly, unlike other tax credits, you can use this for business investments, residential development, including rental housing, and for commercial real estate. So it's not new markets is largely for commercial real estate, although it has been used for other things. LIHTC, we know what LIHTC is used for low-income rental. Here, there's a much broader set of possibilities in terms of what it can be used for. And finally, there's no benefit cap. So, when the government put this forward, it had to figure out how much of this they were going to would be used, because they had to, score it and run it against the deficit long term. Some people think they did an accurate assessment. Some people think it was too conservative. We'll find out. So how useful this is really going to be interesting based on the amount of money at play, how much public benefit there is, depending on your worldview of public benefit. And I'm assuming that everybody on this call has different worldviews of what that might look like. We'll have to do when we'll learn more about that over the next decade as this stuff rolls out. I would say 2 other things. In the case of all of the tax credits that we've all dealt with over the years, in the beginning, there's a tendency for 100 flowers to bloom, and then 100 different ideas of how to use it. And then very often some of those flowers don't keep blooming, or they shrivel up a bit. And then we get a sense of the best ways, the most efficient ways, and the ones with the best public benefit can be utilized here. I think the same thing will happen here. And the other thing that will happen, and you can already see in the way it's been written, we assume that there'll be regulations that will be, the regs will come out in late 2018. We can also assume that over the first couple years, there'll be some changes to that. There'll be some conversations that lots of investors and developers have with the IRS, and there'll be some shifts in the way that we think about it. That's natural to a new type of public policy. So I just want to set the stage here, because I think these points of differentiation about this tax incentive versus other tax credits is, I think, really important. It creates great opportunities, but it also means you have to be, it's really helpful if we focus on this in ways to try to get it right. Look, I think over the last 30 or 40 years, organizations like the Reinvestment Fund and hundreds of others that I could name, some of you are probably associated with it on this call. Organizations have tried to figure out how to mix market incentives and market discipline with public good and with public outcomes around low-income places and around social mobility. This, I think, creates a focus for that, a new focus for it. And in creating a new focus for it, in the nature of the credit, it's possible that we will get more individual investors than we have gotten with those other credits. You know, you think of the new market credits, it tends to be corporations and it tends to be organizations that maybe had a Community Reinvestment Act obligation or a relationship to a set of institutions and census tracts. The potential here is that this will not only be a different way to organize demand, i.e. what you're going to organize in the zones, but this may create a new opportunity for organizing the supply of capital with lots of individual taxpayers who have got a reason to want to defer capital gains tax. This next slide just talks a little bit about what I already went over, which is the issue of selections. By now, all the states have selected. It's I don't think there was another time to get. I think all the selections are in to the IRS. I assume that you'll know in your state. You may already know, but I assume this will become public for all the states pretty soon. And so you'll know what states, what census tracts in your city, in your town, in your rural community, in your metropolitan area have been selected. And I think that's really when, in many ways, the work begins. When we thought about this right in the beginning, my co-author Bruce Katz and myself, when we thought about this, we thought about it in 4 different ways in terms of selection and operating principles. And there's no right way to do it. This is the way we thought about it. And I really mean that. It really depends on what your kind of big goals are in the outcome. And I used a quote here from in this slide from Matthew Taylor in the UK, who said, "A city has to think like a system but act like an entrepreneur." And I think many of us that have been involved in doing this work, I think, can understand that. On the one, we're always looking for ways in which things can be more systematic and therefore more efficient, and at the same time not be so systematic that you lose the ability to innovate and to be entrepreneurial and to stretch the canvas, if you will, to new products and new processes. So when we thought about this, we thought about it in terms of these 4 things. The one thing is, look for places where there's a good intersection of both social need and some kind of market traction. That is, there's the possibility, you can see the possibilities for increased growth as it relates to, from our perspective, job creation in particular. We were looking at it a lot through the lens of job creation. That is not the only lens to look at it from, but we certainly were looking at it from that lens. Now, what we mean by the intersection of social need and market traction, that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I think finding that gray area becomes really important in selection. Number 2, we think it's really important, whether it's around this credit or any credit, is to link capital investment strategies to human capital improvement strategies. If you create jobs, if you expand employment in a particular place, the obvious question, if you care about social mobility and if you care about poor people getting work and moving up a career ladder, is are they prepared to do that? Do they have the skills that they need in order to get there? Think of this credit, think of this, you know, the greatest value you get in this incentive is if the investor leaves the money in there for 10 years, then the actual capital value of their new investment, they don't have to pay any gains tax on that when it gets sold after 10 years. So think of somebody who's 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 right now who lives in one of those zones or in a contiguous zone, and ask yourself the question, with the things that you're investing in, when they are 20 or 25, will they have the skills to be able to get the value out of this? And from our perspective, making sure that you've got the human capital issues right, early childhood, K to 12, career work, not only through four-year colleges, but through community colleges. Making sure you've got that down the right way is what will maximize the advantage for poor people and poor places. A third principle, which should be, I think, makes sense, should be obvious, is don't look at this as a tool that is, in its own world, but think of it as something that is one of many tools in an economic development toolbox. And so embed the tool within broader community and economic development strategies. Right now, Bruce Katz and I are working in 3 cities to help those cities build what we're calling an urban economic development prospectus, which is a way of organizing demand and talking about the various things those cities have in terms of growth opportunities and also in terms of the tools to help enable and facilitate growth. And then finally, use data not only for selection and to guide investment, but to constantly connect people and place and to constantly make improvements in what you're doing. So I realize these are pretty broad operating principles, but I think they're important ones to sort of get going with. On the issue of social need, we spent some time when we were doing this with someone who's also worked at the Reinvestment Fund and consults with PolicyMap, a guy by the name of Ken Gross. And Ken helped build a wonderful indicator system, an index for different levels of social need. And there you see a map of Philadelphia with that index. That index is only for the eligible tracks. For those that have got a premium subscription to PolicyMap, you can get Ken's indicators for the country. We did it for the whole country, and gifted that to PolicyMap because we think it's a really good thing for people to look at, regardless of whether you're using it for the tax credit, this tax incentive or not. And so you can see the need score here. That's Philadelphia. From the brown up top is the lower need, and the blue is the, I'm slightly colorblind, so it's kind of blue, is the highest need. And so while all of those tracks are tracks with high levels of need, we used a bunch of indicators, did what's called a factor analysis, and used that factor analysis to lay out an index. You then can take that, and whether you're utilizing the rich data sets of PolicyMap, you can then say, well, what's going on in those places? And what Ken and I did right to get going is we were curious about where are those places where there's lots of job growth, where there's lots of jobs that are already existing. And so we used the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics survey, which happens at the census block level. And we looked at clusters of jobs and we overlaid it. And interestingly, there are some places where there's high levels of social need, but also an awful lot of jobs. And there are places where you get lower levels of social need, but great numbers of social need, not as many jobs because they're largely residential places. Now, once again, if you're going to use the credit for facilities, some kinds of commercial real estate, residential real estate, you may think about selection in one way, or that may be one type of selection you want to do. If you're going to think about increasing job creation, you may think about it in the way that we did when we put this index together. I would say in the last 20 or 30 years in the US, there have been in many cities and towns all over the country a kind of building out of parts of their downtowns, parts of their midtowns, parts of their university districts and hospital districts. It's happened everywhere. some more successfully than others. Many of them are in areas of high social need. And so all the complexities of how you balance those things without displacing people, how the people that live in and around those communities get access to those jobs, not only the new jobs, but the jobs that they're churning as part of the regular process of employment, that becomes really important. But we wanted to get a handle here on just that intersection. And one of the great things about the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamic Database is you can use it to look at all kinds of things related to existing firms, the age of the firms, the income levels of the people that are in those firms, the number of employees that are in those firms. You can really get a sense. You can find out the backgrounds of the people in terms of their education level that work in those firms. So you may even get a sense, once you look at those firms, where are there going to be a significant number if those firms expand, and they're not all expanding, but if they are expanding, or if there are multiplier job growth in and around them, what are the kinds of jobs that may be being created for people with different education levels, and particularly for people with more limited education levels, where are the entree level opportunities and where are the career ladders going to happen? So if you spend enough time with that database, you get a really good sense of how to utilize this. You know, for our interest was in trying to figure out how to ensure that low-income residents benefit from this, and that can be both in terms of place-based effects. You know, there's properties are being fixed up, there's new retail opportunities, there's, better infrastructure, or it can be people-based effects. The people have more skills, have better information, better social networks, better, sort of basic, some of the basic social welfare things that are needed in order to stabilize households so that they can connect to jobs. In all of these situations, we think that when we're thinking about what's going to come and what's going to happen, it's important that in all of your cities and towns and counties that you have smart, what I would refer to as cradle to career strategies. I use that term. It's been used by others, but it's been used, I think, most successfully by my good friend, Mayor Fisher in Louisville, who's built a really interesting cradle to career strategy. I think cradle to career strategies from early childhood on up are really foundational. It's also foundational and important to have business-led networks that can really identify where they think the job growth is going to be. What are the sectors that are growing in a place? What are the possibilities? What are the barriers to entry that may be distinct from capital? This is a capital incentive, but capital is often necessary but not sufficient in order to move things. So having business-led networks that can be helpful here becomes absolutely critical. Community colleges, I think, are really key anchors. There's 1,100 community colleges in America. I think they're in some ways our most undervalued poverty reduction institution in the country. I think they're underfunded, undervalued. I know they're widely, different in terms of their quality. They vary, but some of the most innovative things that are happening around social mobility are happening in community colleges, which is really the closest thing America has to an organized apprenticeship system. So community colleges and many of these issues, both as it relates to business-led networks and cradle to career strategies, are really important. Transit access really has to be highly leveraged. When I look at a census tract in Philadelphia and think about where the job growth may happen, my question isn't just who are the people in and around in that census tract or around that census tract that may have access. I want to know where can people travel, how easily, at what cost to those jobs as they grow? And is there anything you can do with this investment and with other investments in order to leverage transit access, whether it's new kinds of transportation infrastructure, whether it's new forms, new types of mobility pooling? There are, a variety of things that can happen. So transit access becomes absolutely important. And I know, we've gotten more questions when we've traveled around the country from governors, from economic development people, from many others around the issues of rural development, because let's face it, a lot of economic growth and demographic growth happens in metropolitan economies. Now, I should say that 50% of all rural Americans who are thought of as rural are actually within the labor market shed and the transit sheds of a metropolitan economy. But still, for many people, the question of how you're going to get higher levels of job creation and revitalization in rural America is really important. And it's important because many of those communities have been hit hard by globalization and by change. So some of it happens through farming, and some of it happens through resource development and extraction, and some of it happens through ranching, and some of it happens through tourism, but some of it happens through the fact that we can now use technology to bridge geography in really extraordinary ways. And so some of the same principles around the quality of a place and the quality of a labor force and how it's got to connect to companies to be part of the supply chain becomes also really important in those rural areas. So linking financial and human capital investments, I think, is critical in all of this, particularly as it relates to the technological bridges that can happen in many rural communities. Here is just something that I think repeats some of these issues. We've got an infrastructure of capital intermediaries. We have the other programs. We know where the existing and emerging job and firm growths are. We have really strong anchor institution momentum in some places, stronger in some places than in others. All four-year colleges and all hospitals are not created equally as it relates to that, but those institutions are really important. They're not only important as job creators and as employment centers, but they're increasingly important because they're areas where new businesses emerge, and we get the commercialization of new ideas and technologies, and where there is attractors for many people to come and be part of that community. So, you think about this all over the country. You go to Akron, Ohio, and while Akron was and still is a really important historical place for rubber manufacturing, well, its university is great as it relates to some of the issues related to rubber and polymers. And so it became a great place for that science. There's transferable ideas and business things that can come from that. Much of what's happening in this country that is really important in terms of the reinvention from a different economy to a new economy is moving from Rust Belt to Brain Belt. We're still making, we still make things in Pittsburgh, but we're making different things. But that movement from us being a steel city to being a place that also does autonomous vehicles and robotics, that happened because of some of the same kind of industrial design and innovation that once moved the steel industry, which now is moving a robotics industry. And in a place like Pittsburgh or in Akron or many other places, the role in the case of Pittsburgh of a Pitt or a Carnegie Mellon become really important. So how those anchor institutions relate to the growth of industry and relate to the growth of jobs and momentum around communities, and how you can link lower income people to that so they can be part of that growth becomes really, really important in all of the places that we're talking about. There's a feedback loop, we would say, that you've got to be part of in all of this. And if you've got smart economic development people, which hopefully you do in your cities and states, they're organizing right now investable projects and trying to understand where the capital gaps are. They're getting in touch with and working with networks that can link labor supply and business demand. They are, as investments happen, they're going to try to understand what worked and what the multiplier effects were. They're going to try to understand what that means for new projects, and they're going to constantly, in an ongoing way, be involved in the analysis of social need and market dynamics and try to get smarter and smarter at this as we go forward. You've got here a great example of what they did in Nevada, PolicyMap and new localism advisors. Bruce and I worked closely with some of the people in Nevada. I thought the governor's office did a great job of taking a data-driven approach. They incorporated public comment. Some states did this, some states didn't. I looked, frankly, some states, what they did is they called up the economic development people in every county and said, give us your tracts. And then they tried to reconcile that. And then they sort of gave it to the IRS. You know, who knows, maybe that'll turn out okay. But some places really tried to get it right. They looked at social need issues. They looked at percentages of people in poverty. They looked at unemployment rates. They looked at relative ranking of investment flows. They looked at where the jobs are in all the industries, and they tried to understand what's going on there. And in that sense, tried to build a kind of investment idea here, a kind of investment theory about the place. So hats off to Nevada and many other places. And, you know, I think this is going to take, you know, if this incentive has done anything over this very quick couple months that people had to have to respond to the selection process, what this incentive did is this incentive focused a lot of people on this issue. And it focused a lot of people on the very complicated trade-offs between trying to address social need and trying to have some market traction and market viability in investments and in projects. So I think that's a good thing, and I think hopefully it'll mean something for the incentive going forward. Now, one thing I should just say about the incentive before we take questions, which is important to note, you know, the way the incentive works is that if you're a taxpayer that's had a capital gain, an individual or a corporation, and you invest in a fund, and an opportunity fund, when an opportunity fund is, you know, defined very simply as in a fund that invests at least 90% of its assets at any one time in an eligible opportunity track. If you're do that, and if you do it for, you not only get a deferment on the capital gain that you had, but you get, if your money stays in there for 5 years, the basis upon which you're going to pay that capital gain goes down. It becomes 90%. And then if you stay in for 7 years, it goes down to 85%. So you're going to pay, you not only get the deferral, but you're going to pay less in capital gains than you would have normally. Now, if you keep your money in for 10 years and it's active for 10 years, then the actual value of your investment, won't change significantly the original capital gains deferment that you've got and what the basis is, but the new value of the capital you've invested, that capital appreciation you will pay no taxes on. So if you think about this, and this is where I think this is a very, very complicated incentive that I think is going to get us in really interesting conversations with really interesting models to get this right. You, on the one hand, have something with a profoundly market incentive to it. That is, theoretically, the more profitable this investment, the more you're going to be able to benefit from the tax incentive. Because if you invest in a fund and you get 2 times your money in a return, say it's a venture capital fund, and you got 2 times your money in return over a 10-year period, then you're going to do better in terms of the capital deferment, in terms of not having to pay capital gains on that new investment, than had you gotten 1.5 times. If you got 5 times your money, you'd do better than if it was 3 times or 4 times. So now you've got this really interesting issue of an incentive around profitability versus the social need and reinvestment and redevelopment questions, which all of us know sometimes profitability aligns well with that, but not always. You know, many of us have been in the business of trying to build models of development and finance that are profitable so they can be sustainable, but might not be profit maximizing. And so this credit, again, you don't have to structure it to maximize profits, but the incentive creates some possibility, and there could be some desire to want to do that. Now, in 30 or 40 years, we have created collectively a kind of industry in the public sector, in the private sector, and civil society, again, of trying to link profitability and market dynamics with social returns and trying to address social needs. So the nature of this incentive, I think in many ways, puts on steroids that conversation. And so I'm happy to be part of that conversation to see how we are able to maximize it, both in terms of the flow of capital into the system. And we don't know how much will flow in. We know how much capital gains deferment there is at any one time, or we know how much capital gains has emerged, but we don't know how much of that will go into the credit. Could be a small amount, could be trillions of dollars, could be hundreds of billions of dollars. We don't know. We're going to see. So on the one hand, we've got the specter of a huge amount of money flowing here, and on the other hand, we've got a community investment, a civil society set of organizations that are trying to figure out how do you do this in ways that maximize benefit, not only for the places that are eligible, but for the people in and around those tracks that we think, we want to do everything we can to make part of mainstream labor market success. So I'm going to stop right there for questions, but because as you can see, I'm not lost for words, and so I can go on and on about this. I think we're in the very beginnings of it. I think the reality is when the regs come out, September, October, game will be on in many ways, but communities that are being smart about this are both organizing demand, seeing in those tracks, and organizing capital right now, and trying to figure out, given what the credit says, how you're going to match demand and capital, demand and supply, to get to the social outcomes and the public benefit outcomes that so many of us care about.
We do. We have lots of questions, unsurprisingly. So definitely a lot of interest in the topic. So it is time for the question and answer portion of the webinar. We definitely have had a lot of questions submitted. Some of them we've been able to respond to during Jeremy's presentation. We'll try to get through as many as we can during the Q&A session right now. So I'm going to start with a question that we received from Robert. So this question relates to regulation. So, and this kind of requires Jeremy to kind of do a little prognosticating and forecasting. But Robert says, I realize that the Treasury is yet to issue their guidelines on qualified opportunity funds. However, what's the general thinking on what type of guardrails Treasury will issue specifically as it relates to regulation?
Great question, and I wish I knew all the answers to that. But generally for tax incentives, there are going to be questions about the use. So what can this be used for? We already have some guidelines related to the fact that you can't just sit on the property without doing improvements in it. That's really important. There are going to be questions about do the businesses and do the uses, are they what percentage of the revenue is related to that business in that zone? So there'll be sort of their common tax credit issues related to improvements, use, and the like. I don't know. You can go on. There are many accounting firms that have sort of laid out what we already know about that. And I don't want to give any advertisement for anyone in particular, but go on some of those and they'll lay out what's there. My guess is that the big issues are going to be around qualified projects, and look, we all know that regulation happens often after there are problems. So the good news is we've got low barrier to entry. And as someone who's invested in things and built things and run things, it's part of me that really likes that, right? The bad news is that when the barrier to entry is too low, you may come up with all kinds of problems. So I think the big guidelines will be around what is a qualified use, and what do you have to do to prove that that was a qualified use, in terms of the revenue for the business, and in terms of the improvements that you've got to make on the business, and to show that this wasn't just a way to create liquidity for value, real estate value that was already there, to make sure this isn't just a shell game of moving capital around. So I think that they will be the big issues, Robert. I don't know what the IRS guidelines will be. We're in an administration clearly that likes regulation light, but I think they're the things to watch out for.
Great. So another question that we received is from Jennifer. Let me just find the actual question. So Jennifer's question is specifically related to one of the things that you were talking about when talking about ensuring lower income residents benefit from the growth in this program, or the potential growth in this program. So she was wondering if you could speak to any examples of some of the business-led networks that you were talking about.
So with that, Jennifer, that's a great question. So I think in neighborhoods, you know, look, I think most medical districts, as an example, around the country have got, you know, sectoral-led medical groups that spend time thinking about where their industry is going. And the ones, you know, I just met with a group in Oklahoma City and met with another group recently in Louisville. And they, as an example, have a huge number of people that work there that are relatively modest income workers, and they have to think a lot about where their workforce is coming from, how their workforce skills up, whether the K-12 system, the community college system, or the healthcare, health services, health education system is working or not working for them. So I would say you've got to really think about these things, mostly sector by sector, in particular places. Most chambers are trade groups, right? And you know, as trade groups, there's sometimes limitations in what they can do and what they're really designed and set up to do. So I tend to look for either sector specific or place-based specific examples. All over the country, there's some terrific examples. Ohio's got a bunch of them in the advanced manufacturing realm. So without getting anybody in trouble by not mentioning the other ones, I'd say, you know, go to think in your place, Jennifer. Where is job growth happening? Who are the leading business folks who've got to think not only about job growth, but have got to think about the quality of labor? Who of those in particular are civic oriented in terms of this? And there are often many more of them than we sometimes give people credit for. And sit down with those folks. They become, I think, really important. If I were in Indianapolis, a city that we did a big chapter on, one of the organizations we highlighted, a terrific organization. It is a metropolitan-wide organization. In many ways, it's pretty elite. It's all CEOs. But there's a city where they took the CEOs of all of the foundations, of all of the universities, and of all of the companies, and they got a table. It's called CICP, the Central Indianapolis Corporate Partnership. They've actually done a great job steering their community from what was a long-term emphasis on making Indianapolis, which in some ways was quite successful, long-term emphasis on making Indianapolis the amateur sports capital of the nation. And they took that, as we said in our book, they moved it from basketball to biotech. And as they build out, they're really a good kind of, they've really built a kind of a good operating system for making decisions and making investments. And so you find this in different ways all over the country. Some of them are more public than others. Many of them, some of them are metropolitan wide. Many of them are sector specific. Some of them are, in their DNA, include broader parts of the civil society, whereas others are more formally business organized. So I'd have to know more about if you send these guys an email and I know where you are and find out where you are, I'll look up and call around and ask for you. But I would go to them, to people who are involved in that, and I would ask, really, they've got to worry about, if they're going to grow, they have to worry about the nature of the employment and the nature of their workforce. I think at the end of the day, look, there are many ways that low-income people can benefit from, and also some ways that low-income people can be marginalized by certain kinds of investments. The question of benefiting often has to do with, do you have any asset like property that will escalate in value? But it also has to do with, will this give you greater access to linking into the places and the institutions and the businesses of growth? And do you have the workforce skills? And do you have the networks that'll link you to that growth? And is there a support system that will help you with that? In order to get this right, we're going to have to work from both demand and supply. We will not get it right if we work only from one angle. So I'll stop right there. But Jennifer, you asked a really important question.
All right, I think we have time for one more quick question. And I'm going to try and kind of combine a couple of questions into hopefully something that can be answered quickly. So we had a question from Jeff and a question from Maria that might be somewhat related. So Jeff asked, who do you envision being the capital intermediary players in this? And Maria asked about how can small community banks engage with the Opportunity Zones program? So maybe just kind of addressing both of those.
Well, so I think we're going to get many more different kinds of intermediaries unless we're going to get specs. Let's go back to the first question. Some of the regs are going to talk about, the opportunity funds, and there's going to be specs related to the opportunity funds. But I don't think this is like with new markets tax credits, where there's a set of groups that are organized as a CDE, and then others can try to become a CDE, and then that. I think this is much more of a pickup game for those that have the ability to organize capital and those that have the ability to reach effective deal flow. So could community banks organize funds to do this? Of course. By the way, community foundations could do the same thing. They could organize affiliated for-profit funds that do that. There's nothing necessarily, at least in the regs right now, that would stop that. Will some of the large community investment intermediaries be involved? I would think so. I would hope so. Many of the products, however, that are probably going to be used here are probably going to be equity oriented. Think about the 10-year credit. A 10-year incentive really corresponds to what we've done over the last 30 or 40 years in America by creating lots of 10-year VC and private equity and real estate funds with a set of incentives in those funds. Doesn't have to be created that way, but there's going to be lots of equity that's going to be driven here in these funds. So some of the community development world has less experience with equity investments and equity products than with debt investments. There is going to be an opportunity here to twin the use of this credit with some new market tax credit deals and also some low-income housing tax credit deals, particularly those that have got expiring use, which is an issue for all over the country. So there's lots of opportunities that may emerge that way. We are in a period of trying to figure it out. We're going to be in a great period of innovation. What excites me is that we are going to have new capital players, hopefully, that we can organize around this. So I would think a community bank, or I would think a large private bank, I would think a family office that is interested in impact investing and impact capitalism may have lots of individual investors with capital gains issues that they want to, in some ways, defer or reduce over the period for this incentive. So I think we're going to get new capital sources, and those new capital sources are going to, in some instances, require and demand new types of intermediation. So we don't know all who it'll be. I have to say, I've been pleasantly surprised with the kinds of people that are interested in this and are getting organized around it. It meets the basic definition of what Bruce Katz and I really increasingly call for, which is that we start in this country getting more into the problem solving business and less just into the problem identification business. And so this creates a new tool for solutions, not just for the identification of problems.
Phenomenal. Yeah, that was great. And unfortunately, we probably could be here for another hour getting through all the questions that we received through the GoToWebinar. So, but unfortunately, we're at the end of our hour. So I do want to thank everybody who submitted questions. For any that we weren't able to get through or that Jeremy may not have kind of touched on during the Q&A session, we'll try and cull those together and send those along to Jeremy or see what other kind of insights he might be able to provide to follow up with folks after the webinar, after we conclude. So I want to thank Jeremy. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. Let me just skip. Sorry. It's definitely been an interesting conversation. I hope everyone in the audience found it valuable. Just to reiterate, and I've kind of responded to a couple of folks in the questions area of the control panel, but the webinar will be available online on our MapChats webinars webpage. We'll also send out the video link and presentation slides to all the attendees. Feel free to respond to that email with any suggestions for other MapChat topics you'd like to see or ways that we can improve this webinar series. Check back on our MapChats webpage for details on upcoming webinars. You can also always check out our MapChats blog for more insights into data and mapping. Finally, I just wanted to reiterate that in addition to these webinars, PolicyMap offers quick and easy mapping and data visualization tools, both for free and at various subscription levels. We have a number of data sets in PolicyMap specifically relevant to this opportunity zones initiative in this program, including eligible tracks that have been designated by states thus far, and we're just continuing to add to that. So as soon as the Treasury releases the rest of the nominated tracks for other states, we'll get that data loaded into PolicyMap. We also do have, as Jeremy mentioned, the social need index that he spoke about, which is available to PolicyMap subscribers. We also provide additional data to understand needs such as unemployment indicators, as well as areas of opportunity such as home sale trends. So lots of indicators in PolicyMap that you can use to kind of better understand some of these areas that may have been designated as opportunity zones. So if you've not done so already, I encourage you to sign up for a free trial of PolicyMap to explore how it can help your organization use data to inform decision making. I just want to thank everyone again for joining us, and if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with us.